So far in this class, you've read a few introductory texts that help us set up the class and some of the things we'll be focusing on for the quarter. You've read Andrew Sarris's notes on auteur theory, David Bordwell's short piece on production and authorship, Truffaut's introduction to Hitchcock from his book Hitchcock. Now, one of the most significant concepts of these readings is auteur theory, and it's maybe the most difficult concept we'll tackle this quarter, but it is extremely important. So we'll talk about that first, defining what it is and talking about its origins, and then importantly, talking about how we could think about applying it to Hitchcock. In one of the resources that I've given you for the class in the introductory module, if you look there, there's a handout called Film Terms. And in that handout, there is a very basic definition of auteur theory that you can refer to over the course of the quarter. It goes something like this. Auteur theory, theory of filmmaking, in which the director is viewed as the major creative force in a motion picture. Arising in France in the late 1940s, the auteur theory, as it was dubbed by the American film critic Andrew Sarris, was an outgrowth of the cinematic theories of André Bazin and Alexandre Astruc. The foundation of the French cinematic movement known as the Nouvelle Vague, or New Wave, which we've talked about before, the theory of director as author was principally advanced in Bazin's periodical Cahiers du Cinéma, as we've talked about before, founded in 1951. Two of its theoreticians, Francois Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard, who was also a filmmaker, later became major directors of the French New Wave. The auteur theory holds that the director, who oversees all audio and visual elements of the motion picture, is more to be considered the author of the movie than is the writer of the screenplay. In other words, such fundamental visual aspects as camera placement, blocking, lighting, and scene length, rather than plot line, convey the message of the film. Supporters of the auteur theory further contend that the most cinematically successful films will bear the unmistakable personal stamp of the director. So that is really a pretty basic definition that touches on a bunch of the aspects of the theory. But it's important for our purposes for this class to have read what is considered this classic seminal essay on auteur theory, that is Andrew Sarris's Notes on Auteur Theory, which you read. Now, the essay, I realized, though it was short, it's a little bit dense and difficult. And in other words, even though it is quite short, the ideas in it are very complex. And to make it a bit more complicated, Andrew Saros in the essay is responding to things that you as students haven't read. Saros is responding to an ongoing conversation that had been going on among film critics and scholars at Cahiers du Cinéma and elsewhere. So don't worry about that too much. Don't worry that you're not necessarily fully understanding every aspect of the conversation. Mostly, I wanted you to have access to that essay for reference. And we'll talk about some of the key concepts now in a way that I think will clarify any confusion you might have had in understanding the essay. And it will sort of expand upon that definition I just read to you from the film terms sheet. Now, one of the other short readings that I gave to you, just the one page from David Bordwell and Kristen Thompson's Film Art and Introduction, that page entitled Production and Authorship, that talks about the concept of a director and the question of who has most control of the film. And really, that one little page breaks down the questions surrounding auteur theory and the definition of an auteur in quite simple terms. So if there was some lack of clarity in Cyrus's piece for you, and also after the discussion today, you're still a little bit confused about auteur theory, you can always refer back to Bordwell and Thompson's description for help. Even though it's not by any means a full explanation of the theory, it will essentially get you some of the things that you need to know about auteur theory. Let's dig in a little bit into auteur theory. And just as a note, this will probably be kind of the most complicated thing that you will learn about this quarter. So don't panic if you're not fully understanding everything. That's okay. It's a quite a complex topic, but I'm going to break it down for you, and I think in a way that will be pretty understandable. Just a little bit of a background on Andrew Saris himself. If you remember from the introduction that I gave you to Truffaut's book and the lecture from last time, I noted that there was this group of filmmakers and film critics in France, of whom Francois Truffaut, who of course wrote our textbook and did interviews with Hitchcock, was a part. As I noted in that last lecture, this group of French critics and filmmakers had this film magazine or this film journal called Cahiers du Cinema, where they wrote about films and filmmakers and where they were beginning to identify what they felt were the key or the most important filmmakers of all time. Now, Andrew Saris was an American film critic and scholar, but he had met and he was friends with the writers, many of the writers and filmmakers at Cahiers, and he had read their work and he was influenced by their thinking. So, one of the things that he was doing in the essay that you read for today, Notes on Auteur Theory, was essentially his effort to try to name and describe the approach to film and to filmmakers that the critics at Cahiers du Cinema had, and to try to describe a key concept relative to how they thought about film and filmmakers, as well as he does a bit of answering some backlash against that theory and answers some misunderstandings. So it's really in this essay that Saris coined the term auteur theory in order to describe what the writers at Cahiers du Cinema had been saying about film and filmmakers for quite some time. And Saris then himself, he actually became a leading proponent of auteur theory in the United States. And auteur theory going forward has had this huge impact on the study of film ever since. Even if you don't go into the study of film specifically, this is auteur theory is going to influence the way that people think and talk about film today. Now, there has been a good bit of controversy surrounding auteur theory, and you may have picked up on some of that as you read Saris's essay. It is pretty clear when you start reading between the lines that Saris is arguing against some of the people who had some problems with auteur theory. And we're not going to go into all of that controversy now, but we should define what auteur theory is and what the concept of an auteur is, in part because Alfred Hitchcock was one of these filmmakers that the critics at Cahiers du Cinema, including Truffaut, and Andrew Saros named in the first place as a film auteur. And he helped American critics and scholars understand just how masterful a filmmaker Hitchcock was. Now, I think the concept of an auteur will be useful for us as we are studying Hitchcock for a couple of key reasons. First of all, it will help us describe some of the characteristics of Hitchcock as a filmmaker. And second, it will help us because it describes some of the characteristics of his whole body of work, that is, his films. If you yourself do go on to study more film, you will find it really useful to think more deeply about the complexity and the controversy surrounding auteur theory. And you might even yourself question the whole idea of an auteur. But really, for the purposes of our class, we will accept it as a useful theory. And I do personally believe that it is really useful. And we'll use it as a reference point for the class. But let's get into the basic definition of what an auteur is a little bit more. L'auteur at a basic level simply means author in French. But of course, this term means much more than just that simple French word. In this case, auteur is very specific to film. And again, it comes from these writers and scholars and filmmakers at Cahiers du Cinema who were describing a few certain directors as being so fully in control and so fully involved in each aspect of their work that they were like the authors of a book. But instead of using a pen, they were using this camera pen. Now, if you think about what happens when someone writes a book, you really never question who the author is. It's the person who wrote the words. That's the creator of the book, right? There may be a publisher or there might be an editor involved to give suggestions and to even decide on things like the book cover. Or the writer may have had people that he or she will ask to read the book and give feedback. But essentially, when a book is published, the writer or the author has sole control over the book, and we really attribute the book to the author. Now, with film, it's a little bit more complicated because there are so many people involved in the making of a film, and those people play really key and really influential roles in the film. So, for example, you have actors, they're of course really important. You have the screenwriter. Most directors do not write and direct, they just direct. You have people like a cinematographer, the person who is using the camera and who helps make really huge decisions about camera use and lighting and such. You have an editor who looks at the film that's been shot and decides how to put all the pieces together and which pieces to put together. You have costume designers, you have set designers, you have composers who write the music, you have sound designers. The list goes on. It really takes a lot of people to make a film. It's quite a collaborative effort. So, given all these people, who gets the credit or who gets most credit for the end product? And is it really fair to give one person most credit? Now, with auteur theory, the basic idea is that there are certain directors, not all directors, but certain directors who have so much control over the final visual product and so much of a unique and powerful vision, so much skill in each part of the filmmaking process that the credit should for the film should essentially go to the director as quote unquote the author or the auteur, in the same way that you might describe the writer of the book as the author. Now, Andrew Saras essentially broke down auteur theory into three parts, describing a filmmaker who is an auteur as having three essential characteristics. And an auteur needed to have all three of these characteristics, or rather, his body of work, his or her body of work had to have these three characteristics. Now, the first characteristic of an auteur, Andrew Saras said, is that this is a director who has to have masterful technical competence. He or she knows and can execute the filmmaking process at every stage, what the subject is, the script, the acting, the color, photography, editing, music, costumes, with the highest of skill. Andrew Saras said an auteur has, quote, the ability to put a film together with clarity and coherence. Now, the second characteristic of an auteur is that an auteur must have is what Saras calls, quote, the distinguishable personality of the director, or, quote, the director has certain recurring characteristics of visual style which serve as signature. So, in the same way that we might recognize that no one has the same written signature as anyone else, Andrew Saras is essentially saying that we know these auteur directors by their personality or their style or their signatures. And Saras says that these characteristics come through especially when the directors were working under what's been known as the studio system in Hollywood. This was roughly a period between the 1930s and the 1960s. Now, the studio system was basically this system where these big major studios, Universal Studios, Warner Brothers, MGM, they held certain directors and actors and screenwriters under contract. And these directors and actors and writers were required to be a part of whatever projects the studios decided to make. So, directors under this studio system, under contract to specific studios, really had much less control or much choice in the matter of what they could choose to direct, what story they could choose to direct. And directors under this system rarely got to write their own scripts. So, really, it was just the visual style that they had control over. And Andrew Saros that it says that it's within this very strict control and through this strictly visual sensibility that an auteur director could really shine, because in spite of these restrictions and the control and the control over them and the decisions that were out of their hands, these directors, their personal style really flourished, and you can see it in their films. Now, a third characteristic of an auteur, as Andrew Saras describes it, is that and this is a little bit harder to define and to describe, and even Andrew Saras himself seems to have a difficult time describing it. He calls it interior meaning. An auteur director, his or her body of work must have something called interior meaning. And Andrew Saras indicates that it's this thing that elevates the director's films into the realm of what we might call quote unquote art. He says it's hard to describe because essentially it can only be seen in a film. You can't really use words essentially to convey what it is. He says this thing is, quote, embedded in the stuff of cinema and cannot be rendered in non-cinematic terms. Kind of like you can never really describe a color and understand a color. You have to see a color, right, to know what it is. So that's this ephemeral kind of thing that Saras is talking about that you can see in the work of these auteur directors. He also calls this thing the elan of the soul, or the style, or the flair, or the panache of a director's soul. And in the same way that a soul cannot really be described, but we believe that it exists uniquely in each person, Andrew Saras is saying that the soul of the director might be seen on screen with these certain directors who are auteurs. And Andrew Saras says it's kind of a know it when you see it sort of a thing, a little bit like art. And he can point to specific certain instances or moments in movies that he will see in these auteur directors, but he himself says he really can't make a generalization about what it is. Now, one of the other really important things about auteur theory that Andrew Saris says, besides offering these three characteristics that he gave us, is that the director can only be named an auteur after that director has made a number of films, quite a big number of films, and that you can assess that director's body of work. So he says you can't call a director an auteur by only watching one of his or her films, or after the director has made only one film. You need to assess that director's body of work after a period of time. Now, relate to that too, he also says that a critic can only decide if a director is an auteur if that critic, him or herself, has seen thousands of films. And the implication is that the critic has to have lots and lots of experience watching and assessing films, and needs to have the ability to make connections between films and make observations. And it's only then that the critic really has the skill to make the call about whether a director is an auteur or not. Now, Saris did note that even a critic who is able to make that call will be constantly revising his or her list of these auteur directors again and again. And he said this list isn't really set in stone because no critic really has, even a really experienced critic who's seen these thousands of films, has perfect perception. Now, as you might guess already, one of the criticisms of auteur theory is that it sounds kind of elitist in two ways. So, some people who do criticize the theory say that the theory unfairly degrades the work of some directors and that it unfairly elevates the work of others. And then, second, the critics of auteur theory complain that auteur theory unfairly implies that only some film critics have the knowledge and the ability to identify auteurs. And some might say, well, why does Saris and the critics at Cahiers du Cinema get to decide that they're the ones who can decide which directors are tours and which ones are not? And there is something important to note about the fact that most of these film critics were white men. And they certainly were, and most critics today really even are white men still, and they certainly were at the time that Saris was writing. So, do we say that it's white men who have the best handle on who the best filmmakers are? We should note that Andrew Saris, in his book, The American Cinema, lists only one woman as a possible auteur and his pantheon directors, which he lists. So these are the definitive kind of auteur directors. None of these are women, and all of them are white American or European men. So those are definitely, I think, really interesting criticisms that we need to take into account. I don't think that Saris was intentionally being an elitist, in part because he said himself that his description of an auteur was actually something that he felt would need to be continued to be discussed and amended. So he was putting his definition of auteur out there to kind of get to actually invite pushback against it. And as I mentioned too, he really felt that his own list of auteurs would change and should change over time. So he didn't really think of himself as being infallible. And I think we'd also agree that kind of the more experience writing about and watching and studying films, naturally that critic is probably going to be able to say why something is good more than others. But Saris's criteria are worth thinking about and worth critiquing, particularly with regard to the point that in cinema history, it has largely been white male critics who've been the arbiters of taste. And who's to say that white men are the best ones to decide? And we could look at these lists that have been made and we can ask, is it really a neutral, objective position that these white male critics have had if they've seemed to be able to identify only white male filmmakers as auteurs? So that's a really important point to think about as we consider this concept of auteur. Now, I don't want to spend, again, too much time on the criticisms of auteur theory because I do think at a very basic level, the theory is useful for us, especially in the study of the body of work of a particular director. And it's useful to study in the study of a director who has been recognized and named as an auteur by a certain group of critics and by many, many filmmakers and other critics throughout time. Uh, and auteur theory at least demands that we take a look more seriously at Hitchcock's work and think about it more deeply than we otherwise would. Auteur theory helps us to ask these certain questions that will be really useful in the study of really any director and useful for us in our study of Hitchcock this quarter. So we can ask things like, what can we observe about Hitchcock's technical skill and control and the choices that he's making at every level of the filmmaking process? The subject, the script, the acting, color, photography, editing, music, and costumes. We can also ask, what can we observe about that, quote, distinguishable personality of Hitchcock's? What are some recurring characteristics of style that we might see that serve as his signature? And then we can also ask, is there some kind of ineffable quality that we can try to see and understand in his work? Something that comes through only through this medium of cinema itself, through this visual medium, something that expresses the soul of the director and maybe elevates the work to a work of art in some way? And of course, that last question is really tricky to answer, and perhaps it can never be fully answered, but it is one that I think that we can think about whenever we encounter any work of art, film or otherwise. Is it art? How do we know? What do we see there? Now, just one final few notes. The Truffaut in the introduction that you read for today, he did work to highlight what he believed set Hitchcock apart as great. And he spent some time discussing why he thought people had been dismissive of Hitchcock as well. Some of the key things that I want you to have taken away from that reading, I just want to go through these pretty briefly. First of all, it's really important as Hitchcock notes that Hitchcock has this range, that Truffaut notes about Hitchcock, that Hitchcock has this range of films over the course of his career, from the silent and black and white era to the sound and color. Truffaut felt that range is really important. Truffaut also noted that in Hitchcock's films, Hitchcock's personality and personal preoccupations come through. Truffaut says that Hitchcock's own fears show up on the screen. And Truffaut notes that the artist's mission is simply to share with us the anxieties that haunt them. Consciously or not, this is their way of helping us to understand ourselves, which is, after all, the fundamental purpose of any work of art. So that's something we can think about as we look at Hitchcock's films throughout the quarter. Truffaut also wants us to note the really strong emotions linked to childhood in Hitchcock's films. That's something we can look for. Truffaut wants us to think about Hitchcock's masterful creation of suspense, his skill at creating drama in the ordinary, as it were, his skill at absorbing us as audience members and really any audience. Uh, to be suspended in a moment of tension about what might be quite a normally mundane moment, but Hitchcock has this capacity to capture us in our attention and hold us in suspense. Truffaut also wants us to note the very complete control and single-mindedness of purpose that's really reflected in every aspect of Hitchcock's films, even in really inconsequential or seemingly inconsequential transitions or elements. Truffaut also says that the small external clues in Hitchcock's works really reveal this deeper, more complex inner turmoil, and that every single detail that we see on screen reflects Hitchcock's desire to keep banality off screen. He wants us to be engaged in the drama of every single external clue, and that we see more important. What we see is essentially more important than the dialogue and what characters say. Truffaut also wants us to note that Hitchcock is a really skilled technician in the sense that his control over the film form and his cinematic language is so strong that that control over the form creates the content. In other words, his technique creates content, and that Hitchcock has this unique quality of being skilled at every technical aspect, never losing sight of his artistic aesthetic and never losing control. He's always clear. So everything from his editing skill and his framing, those technical skills add up to the kind of content and the theme of the film. Truffaut also notes that with Hitchcock, everything is expressed visually and it's shown to the audience. Hitchcock never really takes the lazy way out, but he expresses everything visually. Truffaut says that Hitchcock is also, interestingly, he's a voyeur rather than an exhibitionist. So as a voyeur too, Hitchcock is he's inviting us as audience members to participate in it, but we're kind of in this voyeuristic aspect. And we'll talk a little bit more about what voyeurism means when we go throughout the quarter. Hitchcock himself says, quote, "My love for cinema is stronger than any morality." And that's kind of an interesting, perhaps troubling idea to think about. Last, Hitchcock says that, or Truffaut says that Hitchcock is skilled at showing subtext in visual ways. In real life, Hitchcock points out we don't always say what we mean, that the words in that sense are not real, are not realistic, and that Hitchcock, we see in his films, is really interested in what lies beneath the surface of the words, that there's something there that's more true than the words that people say. So in that sense, the subtext in Hitchcock's films is really, really important. That's where the realism is, not in what people say, because they don't say what they mean. So all of Hitchcock's films are about the subtext. And I wanted to leave us with one final quotation from Truffaut, where this is what he says about Hitchcock. He says he is the most complete filmmaker, an all-round specialist who excels at every image, every shot, and every scene, from screenplay to photography, cutting, and the soundtrack. And he has creative ideas on everything and can handle anything and is even an expert at publicity. He says that Hitchcock has complete control over all the elements of his films and imprints his personal concepts at each step of the way. Hitchcock has a distinctive style of his own, one of the few filmmakers whose screen signature can be identified as soon as the picture begins. So, as the quarter goes on, we will watch these 12 Hitchcock films, and let's keep this idea of auteur theory in mind, those marks of an auteur, and consider Hitchcock's designation as an auteur. And as the quarter goes on, let's also keep in mind Truffaut's ideas, his points, and what he sees in Hitchcock, and let's look for those things that he notes about Hitchcock as we go along.